soul. On Zion's glorious summit stood a numerous host singing my blood. They hymned their kings in strength. Yea, I heard the song and strove to joy. I heard the song and strove to joy. Hear all who suffered sword or flame for truth or Jesus' lovely name. Shout victory now and hail the royal Lamb, and bow before the great I am, and bow before the great I am. While everlasting angels roll, eternal love shall feed their soul, and scenes of bliss forever rise in succession to their youth. Rise in succession to their youth. Holy, holy, holy Lord, God of hosts on high adore, who like me thy praise should sing. O Almighty King, holy, holy, holy Lord, God of hosts on high adore. Holy, holy. Be seated, please.
It's such a good song to sing as we prepare to talk about the Unshakable Kingdom this morning. One of the things that preachers try to do from time to time in getting ready for lessons is to anticipate as well as we can any questions or objections that anybody may have to the things that we're going to say. And as much as we can to try to answer those up front so that people aren't distracted as they listen. So I'm going to do a little bit of that, if you don't mind, this morning, because I think that for some of you, in fact, I'm quite confident for some of you, there is already an objection staring you right back in the face, and that is that really how you spell the word unshakable? And the answer is yes, it is. I did my homework on this, I promise. I did what any concerned preacher would do, and I consulted all of the best modern English scholars, including Merriam-Webster and dictionary.com and Google. And they were no help whatsoever, because you can spell it two different ways. You You can spell it with the E or without the E. So I checked out English versions of the Bible, and in all of the English versions, there are 12 of them that translate the Greek word into the English word unshakable. 5 of them have an E, and 7 of them don't have the E, so that was no help either. So I did the only thing left to do, and that was I decided to conduct a highly scientific survey with a diverse and wide-ranging demographic group, and that consisted of my wife and myself. And after doing that, what do you know? Our conclusion was unanimous, that it is spelled with an E, so that's what we're going with. So now that we have that settled, I'd like for you all to think about where we've been so far this year in the book of Hebrews talking about maturity. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time reviewing the texts we've talked about, but I want you just to think about that alongside where we are as a church, where we are as a nation, where we are as individuals. Because I'll tell you, one of the things that has happened this year for just about everybody is we have all found ourselves trying to catch our breath, trying to find a solid place to put our feet, just trying to find something to hold on to that's firm, that's going to hold up. And I'll tell you what this year has reminded me is that if that is not the Lord, then it won't hold. It just won't. And so we see a world full of people trying to find solid places to plant their feet, trying to find places to find rest and to catch their breath and to get a handhold. And they're looking from one place to another and just not really finding any of those things. But I'll tell you what stood out to me is watching people whose grasp is firmly planted with the Lord, in the Lord. And watching how they navigate things like years like this year. And I hope you've been able to do that as well this year, just to watch men and women of faith, either people that you see on a daily basis or people that we see and read about from the scriptures. But I think God has blessed us with those accounts to remind us of the importance of having our foundation in the right place. Now, I want to ask you, I want to try to get you to paint a picture in your mind as we transition into our text, which is going to be in Hebrews 12, and I'll invite you to open your Bibles there. I want you to try to imagine what it would be like if our worship assemblies resembled what Israel experienced at Mount Sinai. And here's how I want you to think about that. Let's say this morning that as you began to drive to get close to the building in your vehicle, you noticed kind of in the general direction of the church building, the meeting place, that there was this really dark cloud in the sky. What was weird about it is that it wasn't like the whole sky was black. It wasn't like there was a storm coming through. It was just like this one area. It was the area you were going to. And it was just enveloped in this huge dark cloud. And as you got a little bit closer to the building, you realized that the cloud was covering the whole building. I mean, it wasn't just up in the air. It was down on the ground too. And everything was covered in this dark cloud. And that in the middle of this dark cloud, there was also thunder and lightning. And it was violent, scary. And as you pulled into the parking lot and you kind of try to make sense of what's going on, and everybody else is doing the same thing, you hear a trumpet. And it starts off, audible but not loud, but then over time it's louder and louder. And then as that trumpet is building to a crescendo, you look up in the sky and a fireball is coming down from the sky, descending on the church building. And as that fireball rests on the church building, smoke starts to go up from the building like from a chimney. I mean, it's unlike anything you've ever seen or even dreamed about. And then as you watch, the building starts to shake. as if there's an earthquake happening beneath our feet. And you get up enough courage to get out of your car and to walk to the building just to see what's going on. And you notice, as you come to the doors, there are barricades, boundary markers, and signs that say, "Do not enter," under penalty of death. If you can get a picture in your mind of that, then you might start to appreciate a little bit about what it was like to be at Mount Sinai. Every one of those things was a part of the Sinai experience for the children of Israel when they came there to receive the law from God. And so what I want to do is begin with this as our backdrop in verse 18 of Hebrews 12. Because the text in Hebrews 12 that we're going to look at is really maybe the final picture, the final portrait that the Hebrew writer wants to leave with these Christians who are tired and worn out and discouraged. And I believe it's one of the greatest, most powerful pictures in all of the whole book. Really, in this part of Hebrews 12, when we get to the second half of the chapter, it's a tale of two mountains, a contrast between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. And I want to read with you starting in verse 18. And let's just notice how the Hebrew writer describes Israel at Mount Sinai, what they experienced. Verse 18 of Hebrews 12 says, "For you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, and to a blazing fire, and to darkness and gloom and whirlwind, and to the blast of a trumpet, and the sound of words, which sound was such that those who heard begged that no further word be spoken to them. For they could not bear the command, if even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling." Let me ask you, if you were one of those Israelites there watching this at Mount Sinai, how close would you feel to God? Any of you? I mean, would you feel like this God, I mean, maybe you wouldn't have any doubts about his power, but would you feel like, now this is a God I can go talk to? I mean, this is a God that cares about, what's going on in my life. Could you approach him like that? Moses could, but even he was terrified. Now, what's really, I think, challenging about this is that in many ways the Jewish people were centuries removed from this. I mean, that relationship, that picture of the relationship with God from the mountain in Exodus was not at all the relationship that they had with their father in the first century, in many ways. So if you were to think about these Christians and where they were, I mean, maybe that's not their picture of God, but what was happening to them? I mean, maybe the picture in their minds of God was more connected to the Old Covenant, the temple worship in the city of Jerusalem, and the priesthood from the family of Aaron, animal sacrifices, all those things that Scott alluded to earlier. And that's perhaps how you viewed God or what you connected with. But for these Hebrew Christians, remember some of the things that they were experiencing at this point in their lives. They were starting to experience social pressure because they had left Judaism to follow Christ. They were experiencing pressure from their Jewish brethren that had stayed under that covenant. They were experiencing ostracism. They were being cast out of their social groups. They were experiencing the loss of status, the loss of possessions. Even for some of them, they were experiencing imprisonment. And so what is really easy to think about if you were a Christian in those circumstances is all of the things that you don't have anymore. You don't have these relationships. You don't have this camaraderie. You don't have this support system. You don't have the temple. You don't have sacrifices. You don't have the priesthood. But what's so profound about what the Hebrew writer does here is he focuses their attention on what they do have. And he contrasts it with that first mountain. At Sinai, the picture of God was one that was physical, tangible. It was a mountain you could touch, even though if you touched it, you would die. It was a picture of a God who, in many ways, at least from their observation, was distant and terrifying and scary. But notice the contrast continuing in verse 22. Here's what the Hebrew writer says. He says, you haven't come to that mountain, but, verse 22, you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel. So the Hebrew wanted them to see a different picture of God, to remind them of what they had that was so much better than what they were leaving behind. And for starters, he says, you have come to Mount Zion. You've come to the heavenly city, the city of God, the heavenly Jerusalem. And what he wanted them to understand was that this was a city, even though they couldn't see it with their physical eyes, and they could turn and see Jerusalem. They lived in Jerusalem. It was a physical place. What the Hebrew writer wanted them to see, though, is that Mount Zion, this heavenly city, this heavenly Jerusalem, was more real than the city they lived in. It was permanent. It wasn't a copy. I mean, as beautiful and ornate as the temple was that people would go to in Jerusalem, and as tangible and visible as it was, what the Hebrew writer points out about those temples and those tabernacles that were constructed in the past is that they were just copies. I mean, the real temple, the real tabernacle, has always been in the presence of God. And that when Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Father, he was able to be in God's presence and to serve in the true tabernacle. And that's what the Hebrew writer wants to remind these Christians that they have. You have come to the real heavenly city. You've come to a divine assembly. An assembly that was composed of both angels and Christians, the people of God. And I'll tell you, if you've ever felt the loneliness of trying to serve God by yourself, if you've ever dealt with the reality of people leaving you behind and keeping you at a distance because of what you believe, then this is something that should be very convicting to us. Because what the Hebrew writer explains is that we are able to come to an assembly that is so much more grand and so much more glorious than any of the relationships that we may lose on this earth. And then he goes on and he says, you haven't just come to the city and the people, but you've come to God himself. In verse 23. And the beauty of this is that this is a picture of a God who is not distant. He was near. He wasn't fearsome or unapproachable. So as we start to develop these pictures of Christians at Mount Zion and what it is that we have, what it is that they had, the reality is that these were spiritual truths that were not distant, that were not terrifying, but comforting. And I think what this would also remind them of is that by being in the presence of God himself, it reminded them that God's presence wasn't defined by a physical temple. I mean, no matter what the rabbis and the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and whoever else stood up and said, God was not in that temple in Jerusalem. In fact, what's really beautiful about this is that when you fast forward to the book of Revelation, and John gives us a more in-depth picture of the heavenly city. Chapter 21, verse 22 tells us that when you get to that place, there's not even a temple there. And the reason is because the Almighty God and the Lamb are the temple. You don't have to go to a building because they are the building. They are the sanctuary. They are the place of rest. And it also points out that God is the judge of all. Think about why that would be so important to a group of people who were being judged constantly by everybody else around them. Judged unworthy, judged to be imposters, judged to be deserters. And yet the Hebrew writer reminds them that you've come to the God who is the real judge of all. And you've come to the righteous made perfect in verse 23. The spirits of the righteous made perfect. Most people believe that this is a reference to those who were faithful as a part of the old covenant before the new covenant was instituted. Some of the great men and women of faith that we read about in Hebrews 11. And what's so profound about that is that it would have reminded these Christians. I mean, you think about names like Abraham and Jacob and Joseph and David and Moses and Noah. I mean, these were people who were revered in Judaism. They were the foundations. They were the pillars. And yet, what the Hebrew writer makes clear is that these Christians were joining these people apart from that old law. That these righteous made perfect were not perfected by that law, by that system, by that temple, or by that priesthood. They were made perfect by Jesus. And that's the last thing in this catalog in verse 24 of things that Christians have in Mount Zion, is that we've also come to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel. We've come to a better covenant. We've come to a better sacrifice. We've come to a better lawgiver. Think about the difference between Jesus and Moses. When Moses went to receive the law, he went up on the mountain and nobody could go with him. When Jesus went up on the mountain, Matthew 5, to receive the law and to give the law, he looked at the people and he said, "Come with me." He invited them to follow him, to know the Lord. And so this is just a small portrait of the difference in these two mountains that was intended to stir up these Christians and remind them that what they were leaving behind was nothing in comparison to what they were gaining. If only they would see by faith. Now, you and I may look at that, we may think about that and say, well, what does that really have to do with us, though? I mean, our temptation isn't to return to Judaism. I've never had a conversation with any of you who are thinking about, moving back to Jerusalem and trying to start up the priesthood, or going back to the old covenant, or worshiping in the temple. I mean, that's not really our temptation. So what does this have to do with us? That may be true, but I'll tell you what's also true is that there is an appeal and there is a pull in each one of our lives to other cities beyond just Jerusalem, other places of safety. There's an appeal in each one of our lives to other assemblies, other places of belonging, our peer groups in our schools, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, in our own households. There's a pull to be a part of assemblies, to belong to something that's different from this. There's an appeal to follow other gods, to seek deliverance from other sources aside from Jehovah. And those are the things that we wrestle with. We may not go back to Judaism, but there are plenty of other mountains and other cities and other assemblies and other gods that call to us and try to take us away. And so I want to take your attention to the rest of the text, to verses 25 through the end of the chapter, to see what we have in this kingdom. Verse 25, the Hebrew writer goes on and says, "See to it that you do not refuse him who is speaking, for if those did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape who turn away from him who warns from heaven. And his voice shook the earth then, but now he has promised, saying, Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven." This expression, "yet once more," denotes the removing of those things which can be shaken, as of created things, so that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude, by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. The comparison continues in verses 25 through 27. And what the Hebrew writer reminds these Christians of is to think about what happened to those who didn't listen to the voice of God at the mountain. Did they make it? I mean, some of them left the mountain, but they didn't make it out of the wilderness. Some of them didn't even leave the mountain. And the writer's point is, if those people who refused God when he shook Mount Sinai didn't escape, when he shook a physical mountain, how much more if we don't listen to God who shakes things from heaven, from Mount Zion? If we listen to that counsel, is it going to be any different for us? Now, this idea of shaking, this picture of shaking, I think is a really important one and a challenging one, I think, for us as Americans, because we value stability and we don't really think of ourselves as being shaken very often. But the reality was that God was in the process, even in the first century, as this letter was being written, God was in the process of shaking the earth. What was either on the horizon or had just happened, depending on your view of the date of Hebrews, was the end of the Jewish system, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 at the hands of Rome. A lot of people think that Hebrews was written just maybe a few years before that happened, leading up to that, in some ways as a warning to the Christians to not put their trust and their hope back in that physical city. God was in the process of shaking the earth, and whenever God does that, it wasn't the first time that he did it. He did it at Sinai. He's done it with every kingdom in history at some point. I mean, he's done it since then in many times in many ways. And whenever God does that, it's always to take things that are shakeable and remove them and leave things that are permanent, to remind us what really is lasting, what really is of value. So in the days of the Hebrew Christians, the first century, what God was preparing to do was to shake the old covenant, to remove it so that a new covenant, a better covenant, remained. But that wasn't really even the final shaking that was going to take place. And it's not the final shaking that's referred to here in this text. The Hebrew writer refers to this quote from Haggai that once more God's going to shake not just the earth, but the heavens as well. When that happens, everything that is not spiritual, every created thing is going to be removed. When that final shaking happens, every city, every stronghold, every kingdom, every false god, that process of shaking is going to reveal something about every one of those things, and it's going to reveal that every one of them is inadequate and impermanent, except for one. There's only one kingdom that is unshakable, that's immovable. And I'll tell you, I think the scary thing about that for us is that so many of those things that have been shaken historically, kingdoms that have risen and fallen, rulers, leaders that have risen and fallen, is that if you were to watch them up until the point that they were shaken, nothing really looked wrong. I mean, how many kingdoms, for so many kingdoms or nations, when they fell, it wasn't like it was a long time coming. Sometimes that happens. But there are just as many times where a nation or a person falls seemingly out of nowhere without warning. And everybody that's put their trust or their confidence in that market, in that money, in that bank, in that nation, in that president or politician, you name it, everybody that put their trust in them because they looked so solid when they were shaken, it was over. What God has done is to give us the one thing that's unshakable. What God has done is to give us a kingdom that can't be shaken. And so the reminder, the appeal of the Hebrew writer is do not refuse him. Think about how everything else you could put your trust in one day is not going to be there. Don't reject the one who's giving you the only alternative that's unshakable. I mean, what, in essence, the Hebrew writer is telling us is that every created thing, this is the Titanic, folks. And it may look beautiful, it may seem unsinkable, but it is going down. And there's nothing we can do about it. But what we know is that there's one place, there's one source, there's one God who's giving us deliverance, who's giving us a lifeboat. And the Hebrew writer says, listen to him. Because if you reject him, there's nothing else that's going to come along. There's no other boat you're going to be able to hop into to ride this through. And so when we realize that, it leads us to the conclusion of this text, which is beautiful. It's what is our response to the offer of this kingdom that is unshakable? How do we respond to that? The Hebrew writer says, since we receive a kingdom like this, let us show gratitude, by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe. Try to imagine if you were one of those passengers on the Titanic, and you happen to be able to get a seat on a lifeboat, but the only reason you were able to get on that boat is because somebody else gave up their spot for you, and just was left out there in the water. How grateful would you be to be one of the ones that has a way out, that has one thing that's not going to get obliterated and fall apart and fall to the bottom of the ocean? How grateful would you be? And if the family of that person at some point in your life came back to you and said, hey, we're glad that you're here. We miss our loved one. But what we want to ask you to do is to do this favor for us, to do something to honor them and remember them. Would it be appropriate to say, I'm really thankful. Don't get me wrong, but I don't feel like I can get on board with what you're asking me to do. But I'm thankful. Is that enough? I think what the Hebrew writer challenges us with is a reminder that gratitude leads us to a place of service. And that as we serve with a certain mindset. We don't just serve mindlessly, but we serve God, this God who's given us the unshakable kingdom, with reverence and awe because of what he's done for us. When we adopt this perspective, the perspective that sees Mount Zion and the value of all the things that it gives us, it allows us to see past the illusion that this world is unshakable. And what it will also allow us to do is it'll allow us to use this world to prepare us for the one to come. And that brings us back to the beginning of this whole study. If we adopt that mindset to see the value of Mount Zion and to see past the things of this world, it will yield growth in our lives. It'll help us find progress. And it'll bring us to maturity. Thanks so much for your attention, not just this morning, but throughout this series of lessons. The invitation is to see what God has given each of us. The one thing in all of history that will remain. You can be a part of it. If you're not a Christian this morning, what is it in your life? I mean, honestly, this is the question. What is it in your life that's worth more? What is it in your life that's more valuable to you than this offer? And if you're being honest with yourself and you realize, there's no reason for me to stay on that boat, to follow it to the bottom of the ocean, if you realize you're ready to turn your life over to God and have a place in that kingdom with that assembly in that heavenly place, then don't wait. You can become a Christian this morning. You can die to yourself. Die to your sins, be buried in baptism, and be a new person. Be a part of that New Jerusalem. If that's what you want to do, we are here for you. We love you. We want to encourage you however we can. And if you have another spiritual need, if you're one of these Christians that's tired, if you're discouraged, we all go through that. But don't go through it by yourself. look to God, look to the scriptures, look to his people, and let's get through this together. Let's get to that assembly together. If you have a spiritual need, come to the front and let us know how we can help as we stand and as we sing.
Soul of Savior, thou art needed. Soul of Savior, waits for thee. Hear the words of tender pleading. Hear his precious come to me. He is calling. Please.